Live from the Mecca, Mormonism, Salt Lake City, Utah. This is Heart of the Matter, where we are talking through a bunch of subjects together about the Christianity in the age of fulfillment. I'm your host, Shawn McCraney. I don't know if you know this, but the way I've kind of orchestrated the year is I've created a pretend couple. And they've been married the way we described what marriage is a number of shows back. And then I take this married couple and we're having them live their lives out as Christians in today's world. And of course, they're living a fictional life, but we're kind of going in chronology of things that happen to a married couple. And last week we talked about sexuality, or not last week, but a number of weeks ago, sexuality and sexual practices. And then we talked about birth control. And then last week we talked about, 2 weeks ago, we talked about abortion. And then last night we talked about adoption. So we're not doing all the A's. It sounds like we are. But tonight we're going to talk about another A word. It just happens that they all sort of start with A that have to do with being a couple, married. And that is a big one. It's the A word called adultery. Adultery. So according to the GSS, which is a general social survey cited by the Pew Report study on infidelity, quote, in general, men are more likely than women to cheat, as 20% of men and 13% of women in general reported that they had sex with someone other than their spouse while married. Now, that's a general overview from the study. What's interesting is that age plays a really significant role in understanding these figures. For instance, among ever been married adults between the ages of 18 to 29, people who have been married between 18 to 29, women are slightly more likely than men to have had an affair. 11% of women between 18 and 29 said they had, and 10% of men in that age said they had. That's interesting that at that age and in that range, women are more likely than men. And we could come up with all sorts of guesses as to why. They're young, they're feeling unwanted, they're immature, their new husbands are selfish or abusive, they've married too early and they feel like they're missing out on life. We could go on and on with why. But that kind of close gap, even though women are just a little bit higher there, it really flips from the ages of 30 to 34, and it just continues to grow wider and wider and wider, with men taking the lead and women staying below them from that point forward. Also, in both genders, infidelity increases in the Middle Ages, though the rates for men remain higher, of course, but both groups increase when both groups hit the Middle Ages. And the age when women report the highest rate of infidelity, you're not going to believe it, in their 60s. In their 60s. That is really something that that in the 60s, more women who are married have extramarital affairs than they ever had in their lives. And what happens after that, though, is when they hit their 70s, it dramatically decreases. And then when they hit their 80s, it dramatically falls even farther. And you will say, well, of course it does. They're in their 70s and 80s having affairs. No way, come on. Well, what might surprise you is that the highest rate of infidelity for men, believe it or not, occurs in their 70s. In their 70s, and it even remains high going into their 80s. Thank you, Viagra. That's one of the main things that we see as it happening. So the greatest gaps in cheating among the genders peak in the oldest age groups, because men in their 70s and 80s are going at it more than they ever have. That surprised me. And women are dropping off, and so the biggest gap between them is then. One study I read suggests that parents who remain married lowered the statistical rate of adultery in their children. But it also concluded that race, age, fornication prior to what they call marriage, and as we have said, gender, all play a significant role in who will cheat and who will not. Two factors that are not so big in swaying the numbers are political parties or education. Those don't seem to do too much. However, the one statistic that was not surprising but super sad, and we're going to talk about that in our next show, but that is among people who have ever been married, who have cheated on their spouses, 40% are currently divorced or separated, but by comparison, only 17% of adults who were faithful to their spouse are no longer married. So bring an affair into a marriage and your chances of divorce almost triple. Almost triple. That's pretty radical. Flip it around. Less than half of cheaters are currently married, compared with 76% of those who did not cheat and are still married. So when you bring infidelity, affairs, extramarital relations, whatever you want to say, sleeping around, schlepping around, playing the field, being the donkey, I don't know what it is. When you bring that into the marriage contract, it has detrimental effects to the survival rate of that union. And while this is what I ultimately want to speak to, which is divorce, which we're going to cover in the next show, let's stick with adultery itself. The first time the word adultery is used is in Exodus 20:14, and that's when God is telling Moses what the 10 Commandments are, and it's really plain. Exodus 20:14 says, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." That's all it says. Interestingly, an adulterer is, in the Old Testament sense of the world, was when a man had illicit intercourse with a married or engaged woman. And a woman does the same with a married or engaged man. She would be an adulteress. He would be an adulterer. Intercourse between married people and an unmarried person was called fornication by the Jews, not adultery. In the Mosaic world, adultery was regarded as a super egregious wrong and was punishable by death. So when we start in the biblical sense of the sin or crime, it was punishable from the onset of the law with death. And remember this because it is the starting point for how the nation of Israel historically looked on the sin. It's worthy of death. Now, how am I defining adultery? I'm defining it as this: when either partner in the marriage has sexual relationship with someone outside of that marriage. I am not about to try to define the relations or actions here because there are 10,000 definitions people have, meaning to some people, if you sneak a phone call to an ex-girlfriend, some women would say that's an affair, okay? So in the end, I'm going to define, based on everything I was able to read and study about it, adultery sort of like the working definition of pornography. And the working definition of pornography is material that stimulates erotic or sexual feelings in the viewer rather than aesthetic, intellectual, or emotional feelings in the same. Now, that is really a broad-based definition of pornography, I know, because there are some people who become sexually aroused by very odd things. You know, automobiles and shoes and windy days. They're getting all hot and bothered. But to them, those things would be defined as stimulated erotic feelings, and therefore for them, such a thing could be defined as pornographic in their lives. If you have somebody who, for whatever reason, becomes aroused at the sight of a billy goat to them would be defined as pornographic in their lives because that's the thing that stimulates them sexually. I use or borrow this definition from pornography and assign it to adultery because everyone knows, we just have to be frank, when they're involved in any level of an illicit relationship, they know what they're doing, they know what they're after, they know how they're thinking about what's going on, and they know what's turning them on, no matter how the turn on is manifesting. And I say this because there are a lot of people who will justify illicit relationships as innocent because it hasn't produced any kind of sexual engagement. And so through this definition, adultery takes on a better stance and leaves it to the individual to admit what is stimulating them or not. So therefore, I define adultery as a person who is stimulated erotically rather than aesthetically, intellectually, or emotionally by another who is not their spouse. That is the working definition I'm going to use of adultery. If you don't agree with it, write your comments below and tell me why. Now, I realize all sorts of bells and whistles are going to go off when I say that because of the games people play with words and with definitions. And many men will justify flirting, and many women will justify friendships with other men by just saying, nothing happened, right? And so it's not whether something happens or not. It's what's happening in the mind and heart that makes adultery what it is, with the things happening coming later as a natural result of what's going on in the mind or the heart. Think of it this way. All married people have emotional, aesthetic, or intellectual attractions or stimulations with others who are outside their marriages. A man could aesthetically love a female painter. A woman could be stimulated intellectually by a professor. A couple could go to a movie and cry by the portrayals of the actors in the movie. That's being human. Because you're stimulated intellectually or aesthetically or emotionally by others in your marriage does not make that adultery, all right? But when a man loves the aesthetics of his neighbor's wife, or a woman is stimulated intellectually by her coworker on lunch breaks, or a couple allow each other to fantasize about sex with their favorite movie star, they cross the line of aesthetic, intellectual, and emotional attraction and move into the realms of erotic attraction. And that is the definition, the beginning definition of adultery. Doesn't this definition then make most people guilty of adultery? It certainly does. Yes, it does. And I didn't create it just for the sake of being able to condemn everybody. It was Jesus who said in Matthew 5, 27, 28, you have heard that it was said of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, this is Jesus now, I say unto you, that whoever looketh on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in the heart. Okay? So Jesus is suggesting that adultery begins in the heart. It begins with the mind. It begins with the attractions to somebody else erotically, even though what is attracting us might not be in the erotic field. That's why you can be guilty of being an adulterer in God's mind when he looks upon your heart, even if you go through life and nothing ever happens. And Jesus did this to convict everybody in order to show us that we need to have our hearts changed and not just our outward actions. This was something new that Jesus brought to the game. The Jews were really satisfied with themselves and their purity if they were married and they never touched another woman. That was the law, and that was how the law worked. Touch not, taste not. But the king of the heavenly kingdom wanted to show them that there was more to being a child of God. And that was what starts in the heart. That's why it says in 1 Samuel 16:7, it says, men look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks upon the heart. And it is upon this take of adultery that I want to go now. Remember the sentence for adultery that I made mention a few minutes ago in the Old Testament? It was death by stoning. We saw that played out, though the citation I'm going to read to you is considered spurious by some scholars, in the story of a woman who's caught in the very act of adultery. The very act. That means she's naked and romping with a guy, and the Jewish leaders come in and they catch her in that act. Right? Remember it? It's a profound teaching, spurious or not, and it tells us how we too ought, Jesus teaches us how we too ought to respond to people who are in adulterous affairs, committing adultery in whatever shape or form. Jesus teaches us right through this. So what do we read? It begins in John 8, it's in John 8, beginning at verse 2. It says, "And early in the morning, he came again into the temple, and all the people came unto him, and he sat down and taught them." So it was a teaching moment, and the people are all gathered around him, and he's sitting there, and he's teaching. That was a gathering of people. That was an ecclesia. In my estimation, that was a church. That was a church setting. And they're learning from the master in the temple. Verse 2, verse 3, "And the scribes and Pharisees, the keepers of the law, brought unto him a woman taken in adultery, and when they set her in the midst," and when they had set her in the midst. So what they did was, Jesus is there teaching, and they break through and they have a woman and they sit her right in the middle of everybody who's listening to Jesus. No different than an elders board will do, when they discover somebody's in an illicit affair and they decide to go after them, they bring that person in the midst and they make sure they all point the fingers. They hold court, a court of condemnation, a court of death on the person caught in this heinous act that was worthy of death in the Old Testament. And in this account, the accusers present their opening arguments to Jesus, the Pharisees and scribes, and they say, "Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act." So there's no question about this. Boom, we caught her. "Now Moses," they said, "in the law commanded us that she should be stoned. But what sayest thou?" And they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down, and with his finger he wrote on the ground, as though he heard them not. I love that, man. I just love the Lord. They are bringing somebody to him. They caught her in the act, and they tell Jesus, and he just starts writing in the dust of the temple there on the ground with his finger. I find that act of writing with his finger really symbolic, as it was the finger of God that wrote the 10 Commandments in stone, and now they were approaching Jesus with the 10 Commandments, the law that Moses gave, and Jesus starts writing in the dust. What is the dust in a temple? It is the worn away stone. It's the sand. It's particles of that solid law broken down, and Jesus is writing in it with his finger. It's beautiful, and he writes as if not hearing them, verse 7. "So when they continued asking him, he lifted himself up and said to them, He that is without sin among you, let him cast a stone at her." What more do you want? This is adultery. This is still under the law. Jesus, God with us, has a woman thrown at his feet. She's guilty. She's charged. The law convicts her. What do you want today from the action? I know what most people want, but it's right here. You see, when we take what Jesus said and did about adultery, that it's in the heart, we are all guilty of the sin if we're married. Why? Because we're human. We have experiences in our lives, and we have genetic makeups, and we have our flesh, and we have our selfishness, and we have desires. And we wind up in situations sometimes. Sometimes we choose wrong. Sometimes we're strong. Sometimes we get caught up in it. Whatever it might be, whoever is without sin, let them cast the first stone. I don't know why we forget this over the course of the past 2,000 years of Christian history. I don't know why, Nathaniel Hawthorne had to write the Scarlet Letter, or the Crucible was all about them putting people to death for this. I don't know why Christians have jumped on this one so strong, when right here in Scripture we see what Jesus does with it. But nevertheless, that's what we do. And after he says this, he stooped down and he wrote on the ground again. Now, some scholars suggest something interesting. They say at this point that what Jesus was writing was the name of the accusers and their particular sin. That's total conjecture, but if it's true, it's remarkable. There's Ebenezer, masturbator. Ooh, Ebenezer. What's it say in verse 9? And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest. Let's say that was Ebenezer. He sees that in the sand and he's like, I'm out of here. And let's take Jonah. Beats his girlfriend. Whatever it is. He could have been just writing names and listing their sin. Let those of you who have no sin, you cast the first stone at her. Why don't we keep this in our hearts? Why don't we keep this in our hearts at abortion clinics? Why don't we keep it in our hearts when we are judging homosexuals? Why don't we keep this in our hearts when we are judging and condemning other people in the churches we go to that we find out messed up and put their marriage in jeopardy? Why don't we have this heart that we are absolutely right and justified to point out someone else's sin when we don't have any? I don't know. People say I'm a liberal. I don't think I'm being liberal. I think I'm being realistic. I think I'm following what the Scripture says. So even unto the last of these accusers, they departed, and Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing still in the midst. Now Jesus has the chance. Oh boy. You whore. You, because of the way adultery's defined, she was having sex with a married man. She was just helping destroy another man's marriage. Horrible. No doubt. Not good. And now Jesus, God with us, he has the chance to take this woman and her actions with this illicit lover and condemn her and banish her and make her feel badly and put a scarlet letter on her and cast her out and have her stoned. Verse 10. When Jesus had lifted up himself and saw none but the woman, he said to her, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Has no man condemned thee? Verse 11, she said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. He didn't say it wasn't a sin. He didn't say it wasn't appalling. He didn't say it wasn't bad. He didn't say it wasn't harmful. He called it a sin. He said, don't sin anymore, but I don't condemn you. Had the woman repented? She hadn't. We don't see her saying, please forgive me, God. We see nothing like that. Not according to the story. Did she confess? She was caught. That's for sure. But none of the things religion wants to extract from sinners is there, especially adulterers. Jesus didn't try to extract from her a confession. to come before the congregation and confess her sin and have the elders, that deserves excommunication. We have decided because we have no sin, we can do that. Because we have false authority, we can convict other people. Such baloney. What did Jesus do? He showed mercy. Mercy, which is when we deserve punishment and we don't get it. That's a pure product of agape love. And he did this in the midst of the assembly, or what we would call the church that had gathered around there in the temple and listened to him teach. And in this model, we find the fulfillment of Romans 2, where Paul says it's the goodness of God that leads us to repentance. It's the goodness of God that leads us to repentance. It is not the wrath of man. The anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. That's another scripture. We cannot think that we can go after people and their sins and problems and think that that's accomplishing God's will, when it's the goodness of God, the love of God in the face of our sin, that while we were yet sinners, he gave us his son. That goodness is what caused a guy like me to say, I'm turning. Because the damn religion, when they tried to do it, it was, forget you, because I know what you guys are like. I know what you're all like. And there's no way you're going to cast down judgment on me when I know you're worse than I am, at least in the things I've seen you do. But when I see God loves me so much that his goodness is extended to me, a reprobate, I say, I want to please that God. I want to change. That's what Jesus just did with this woman. As you know, ashamedly, from the show a number of weeks ago, I have a master's degree in fornication and a PhD in the charge of adultery. I talked about that in my life. And I experienced the religious response to my sins and saw that it accomplished nothing in my heart. Sure, I could look contrite before a tribunal, and I could look fearful with the rocks that were going to be cast at me for my egregious sin, and I could hang my head and have that face of shame, but nothing inside really changed because of what men did. And it doesn't really change if men and women are mean to people who have problems with their sin. It doesn't change them. It actually makes them more bitter and probably more deceitful. My proclivities were in part due to experiences and history and upbringing, genetics, my personal desires to connect with as many people as possible, and of course, lust. But I could not be governed or changed by external religious authority or rituals, which typically handle cases of adultery by putting people to death in the social halls of religion. Did you hear about Susan Jones? Did you hear what she did? Oh, that's terrible. What a horrible woman. Oh, we can't associate with her. Did you hear what Mike Anders did? Hope there's no Mike Anders out there. It's unbelievable that we think that we have the right to pick up the stones with our mouths, with our gossip, with our authority. I really get the pain and the damage and the utter selfishness that's involved in adultery. And I know firsthand the pain it causes. It is horrible in the hearts of spouses, and then it's horrible to children when they find out or they know that parents are falling apart because of it. It is a horribly egocentric, selfish act that we do. No question. But in order to salvage the fallout from the act, we have to, in my estimation, respond to the guilty party in a different way in the age of fulfillment. Why? Because to join the stoning party will do nothing but put the guilty party to death. And it will leave children without a father or a mother. That's what it's always done. as it breaks up the families. My actions as a married man in the past were abhorrent and selfish and egotistically driven. I acted on the immediate, and I refused to allow myself to escape from the realities of life. And I purposely engaged in escaping from the realities of life and the challenges of marital difficulties. But worst of all, the actions forever marred the most important people of my life, my wife and my 3 daughters. They really did the damage to them. But listen closely. The religious response to me was to shame, reject, excommunicate, and punish. The religionist told my wife that she was to divorce me, that she had biblical grounds. We're going to talk about that next week. And that she should find a worthy man to be with her as a husband, to split up the family and take my daughters and let the worthy man raise them. And while all of it was true in terms of my character, did they ever consider what their advice would do to my family if my wife carried that out? Now, I know, you could say, well, what about your actions? Did you ever consider what your actions, you adulterer, would do to your wife and your children? I was not capable of such humility. I was not capable of that kind of love. I was too selfish, too out of my mind with ego, and to tell you the truth, there was only one solution that would change this wretched heart, and it was Jesus in 1997, you see. So you can say, well, you should have thought about what would happen to your wife and kids. I wasn't capable of doing it. The religious response to my insanity was nothing more than more insanity. It's like, yeah, he really blew it. Now let's destroy their whole family. And then their response would be, you're the one who destroyed your whole family. And I can say, yes, I did, but can we work on trying to salvage it? Instead of using this idea, because it's Jesus talking to people in his day who are under the law, that except for fornication, you shouldn't have a divorce. But when fornication or adultery comes into the mix, have the divorce, you have biblical justification. It's insane. It's insane thinking. So my actions undoubtedly destroyed some of the fabric of our family unit, and there's still deeply felt pains in the hearts of my wife and daughters from my actions years ago. Deeply felt pains. But the solution, the real non-religious based solution to my selfish actions have proven themselves more than capable to fix this ugly situation, and in the end has turned all of it to good. All of it to good. Which is why I'm recommending this approach over what has been in the past. And I've lived it firsthand. I've seen it work not only in my life, but in the life of my wife and my daughters. That there can, when Jesus is embraced and involved, be a healing that even strengthens the family unit in a different way. Pain is still there from my actions. But this old school method of doing our checklist, was there an affair? Divorce is permissible. I think you should leave the bum. I think we need to change our thinking. I think we need to start preaching this love and start responding to people taken in the act of adultery the way Jesus did. In the event a spouse commits adultery on the family, and that's what it is, it's on and against the family, the guilty spouse has to be met with agape love. This love can take the form of anger, because people should be angry, and it can be direct, and it can express grave disappointment. It should express the pain that the guilty party has caused in the hearts of spouse and or children. Absolutely. But it has to be couched in the fruit of the Spirit, which is patience, long-suffering, peace, truth, and hope. The reason this approach is necessary is because the offender is or has been under a spell. And I just want you to understand this. It's a real thing. And we might summarize the spell as the power of everything fleshly coming in at once over a person. The basic truth of adultery is that it's of the flesh. And it's one of the acts, maybe close like with murder, where all the elements of the flesh come in at once and are in operation on the person. And it's an overwhelming power and spell that falls on the people. And I speak from this not just from personal experience. I've been involved in numerous not counseling, you can't say that, advising people through the Bible who are in the midst of affairs and marriage divorces and all this, and the spell is present. It's all the flesh, as Paul writes in Galatians 5:19. Now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these. Adultery is the first one he mentions. When the nation of Israel turned against God, Jeremiah called the nation's actions adultery. She was an adulterer because she had gone a whoring after idols. That was the definition. God had his bride, the nation of Israel. She didn't want that relationship with God. She wanted to go a whoring after idols. And so the nation wasn't satisfied with the goodness of God as its spouse. And it didn't appreciate God's absences from her. And it wanted a spouse who was on hand for her immediate needs. And so they turned to idols and imagining that the idols were capable of fulfilling their every wish. Same thing happens in the cases of adultery today. It's a form of idolatry. And the person thinks that another person can fulfill their needs and wants better than their real spouse. Somewhere in this delusion, this fantasy, the flesh of the participants becomes so ensconced in this spell, they're blind to the realities around them. They will sell their soul for a mess of pottage. They cannot see the forest for the frickin' trees. And the realities of the harm they're doing to those they love, or of the failures in the object of the thing they're idolizing, you don't see them. You think the one that you're with is something better and that they don't have problems. You're blind. You're under the spell. And so it takes love, and it takes long suffering, the fruit of the Spirit, and it takes all those elements of the Spirit to break through that person to help them wake up and see they're totally effed up. They are really jacked up. When we come at them with, you are bad, they're like, you don't know the love I've found. I've been looking for this my whole life. All the rhetoric comes out because it's just the spell. I've heard many people tell me, and actually I've heard kids tell me, I don't even know who my dad is when they get under this spell. That's because the dad they knew, who was selfless and humble and grateful and was dedicated to them and wasn't lazy and was someone with an eternal view, has become somebody totally under the spell who is now selfish and arrogant and ungrateful and not dedicated to their needs and lazy, taking the lazy, easy way out, and someone with the immediate view. And so they actually, in this spell, children will see their parents fall into this and they'll be like, I don't even recognize them. That's how powerful the spell is. So instead of daddy being there, humble and grateful, daddy's become arrogant and proud and uncaring. Instead of mommy being there and dedicating herself to them, mommy is living her life because it's her time now, right? And instead of being someone who labors and works for the family, daddy's off spending the college funds on trips to the Bahamas with his new idol. And instead of someone with an eternal view, the adulterer looks to the immediate, lives for the immediate, and tosses all long-term blessings out the frickin' window. That spell, while it can be broken through external religious pressures, the heart within, if it breaks under the pressure of force, remains the same. I know this from experience. And so this is the first responder's goal in the face of adultery. You break the spell, and you break it through these unconditional, long-suffering, painful, patient love. And if we try to break the spell through threats and anger and condemnation, then those are fleshly reactions. And then the flesh of the person is fully engaged, and they will respond with their flesh. And the dumb dad will run off with the secretary and think he's found happiness, and divorce will ensue, and the kids fall apart, and everything is shot to hell because we used flesh instead of using the spirit to reach into the flesh. And so we go to work on the heart of the matter, and we gently introduce and reveal the guilt of their selfishness. We gently show them their ego is at play. We show them that they are not living in reality. We show them kindly and through friendship and calls and visits and dinners and going out for a coffee or a drink, that their worldview is in the immediate and not the eternal. And we do this as a means to save the marriage. And we do this as a means to save the family. I know there are exceptions when marriages should end. We're talking about that next week through divorce. But we're talking about that ridiculous idea that because a man or a woman loses track of their senses and goes off and schleps around with some idol, that family should be broken up. The wife or the husband should find new spouses, and the kids should be left hanging in the lurch. And this brings me to my final point tonight. How long have I gone, Seth? As Christians living in the age of fulfillment, we discard the standard modes of operation that have long been used and applied, and we seek to make reparations and repairs and reconciliation in every situation where a couple has been broken up from an affair. And for some reason, people just love putting that damn scarlet letter on other people. They love seeing it, and they love to just chit-chat away and have women leave their rotten husband and break the family up. I swear I'm fighting everything in my power to not drop the F-bomb right now. I'm sorry, it's just so close to my heart about how insidious that is. I am living proof that God through Christ can really, really step in to the most incomprehensibly bad situations. And he can turn those lives around of everybody involved and bring healing and bring unity if people are couched right. Of course, because of the pain I've caused, if I could rewind and take all my actions back, I would, but that's not how life works, does it? We can say that, but we can't do that. So let's just face the facts. When someone does something like what I've done and what other people have done, when you do that, the damage has happened. We have to decide in this age of fulfillment, are we going to be a group of believers who step in and rally around and we help heal that damage? Or do we cast in the fire and we cast in the gossip and the meanness and we try to let everybody suffer in that poor family? So what we are talking about is how to handle life as it happens, not as we wish it would happen. And when it comes to adultery, the question is not, can it happen? It can. The question we want to address is, what do we all do? Spouses, children, in-laws, friends, neighbors, pastors, churches. How do we respond to a couple and their family that we love where one of those members of the marriage have gone astray? How? And that's where the change needs to be different in our day and age. I think Jesus gave us the perfect answer in the woman caught in adultery. I really do. Listen, write your comments below. We're going to cover them in a week from now. Tomorrow night, Tuesday night, we're going to cover divorce. And so we're not going to respond to your questions because I'm going to be out of town. So tonight was adultery. Tomorrow, Tuesday night, instead of following up on adultery with your questions, we're going to then follow up with a show about divorce. And then the following Tuesday, we're going to cover all of this with your questions and your comments and insights right here on Heart of the Matter.